Welcome everybody, Mike Fave here. I'm back again today with another weight loss study from a bioenergetic perspective. Today's weight loss study is the study is titled Metabolic Adaptation to Weight Loss, Implications for the Athlete. Now, the study is geared around athletics, bodybuilding, different types of sports that require you to maintain a very lean body mass, and then the negative effects on hormones. But I think that this has pretty significant crossover to just general weight loss overall. And so I'm not going to read every single element of the study today, but I am going to pick out the key points. So with that aside, let's jump in. They start today, or the first piece that we're going to cover today is just a little intro on what the study is overall going to be about. They say, energy deficits and extremely low levels of body fat present the body with a significant physiologic challenge. It has been well documented that weight loss and energy restriction result in a number of homeostatic metabolic adaptations aimed at decreasing energy expenditure, improving metabolic efficiency, and increasing cues for energy intake. While the unfavorable endocrine effects of contest preparation have been documented in male bodybuilders, anecdotal reports from physique athletes also describe a state in which metabolic rate has slowed to an extent that exceeds the predicted magnitude, making weight loss increasingly difficult despite low caloric intakes and high training volumes. Although such reports could potentially be related to inaccurate dietary reporting, these claims may be substantiated by a number of metabolic adaptations to weight loss, including adaptive thermogenesis, increased mitochondrial efficiency, and hormonal alterations that favor decreased energy expenditure, decreased satiety, and increased hunger. So what they're talking about here is that when you have athletes or you have anybody who's trying to lose weight, they're at a certain threshold or at a certain point, the body starts to basically upregulate hormonal processes and different energy cues that make it more difficult to lose weight and then increase the risk of or increase the ability to put on weight. So some of the mechanisms that they discuss here are decreasing energy expenditure. We're going to get into what specifically that looks like. Improving metabolic efficiency. So in this case, I think they're referring specifically to a lowering of uncoupling, which is essentially instead of producing ATP from the substrate oxidation, you actually produce heat through uncoupling protein. So it actually decreases that. So much more of the substrate is going to produce ATP. And we'll talk about, there's different circumstances which uncoupling proteins can be upregulated. And then increasing cues for energy intake. So talking about switching hormones around that increase appetite versus decrease appetite. So you have multiple mechanisms going on here. There's also the discussion of some catabolic hormones as well, like glucocorticoids. So what they continue to say here is, as a dieting phase progresses, such adaptations may threaten dietary adherence, make further weight loss increasingly difficult, and predispose the individual to rapid weight regain following the cessation of the diet. So as you try to lose more weight, as you increase your caloric deficit, increase your energy expenditure, these adaptations that take place, some of the ones that I just discussed, make it harder to lose weight over time and make you more likely to put weight on as you go. Now, I mentioned this earlier that there's like a threshold. It's not necessarily a threshold. There's kind of like a gradation where if you keep digging in the deficit, you keep upregulating the activity levels, you keep dropping that body weight. Because again, in a lot of these states, the goal is to drop body fat, but if depending on how you do this, you will also drop a significant amount of lean tissue. The goal will be to minimize that. They talk about some strategies here, very basically though. But as you progress through that, losing that body weight, etc., what you start to see is greater upregulation in these adaptive processes to allow you to hold on to your body weight and then also increase the ability of your body to put on weight subsequently. So it's a kind of a losing battle. There's a certain point where if you're in too much of a deficit or you're exercising too heavy, where it just becomes unfeasible to continue without causing like very severe metabolic aberrations that make you more likely to put on weight on the back end and perhaps overshoot, which we'll talk about here. So this next section, they have the endocrine response to an energy deficit. In this section, what they're talking about, they're going to briefly cover some of the hormones, many of the hormones that we've actually discussed in the bioenergetic sphere multiple times, whether Jay and I have done it or I've done it by myself, etc. They're going to actually cover those here in this paper. And then they're going to talk about some of the relevance of these hormones. So they start with thyroid hormone. They say the hormones of the thyroid gland, particularly triiodothyronine, which is T3, are known to play an important and direct role in regulating metabolic rate. Increases in circulating thyroid hormones are associated with an increase in the metabolic rate, whereas lowered thyroid levels result in decreased thermogenesis and overall metabolic rate. So they're setting the stage here with thyroid hormone. Increase active thyroid hormone in the form of T3 is important in increasing metabolic rate, whereas decreasing thyroid hormone levels, specifically decreasing T3 levels, maybe increasing reverse T3 levels, has a negative impact on the metabolic rate. The metabolic rate actually decreases, thermogenesis decreases, etc. Next hormone they talk about is leptin. They say leptin, synthesized primarily in adipocytes or fat cells, functions as an indicator of both short and long-term energy availability. Short-term energy restriction and lower body fat levels are associated with decreases in circulating leptin. Additionally, higher concentrations of leptin are associated with increased satiety and energy expenditure. So leptin is a hormone. It's released by the fat cells, as they mentioned. And what happens with leptin is leptin increases satiety signaling. So basically saying that you're full, and then it also increases the amount of energy that you expend. So if you have higher body fat levels, technically you should have higher leptin levels. And with higher leptin levels, you should have increased satiety and increased energy expenditure. It's essentially a signal saying, hey, we have enough energy on board here. Now, something to keep in mind is in obesity, leptin signaling, as I discussed in the obesity paper, gets dysregulated where you get something called leptin resistance. And I put that in quotations because it's not really a resistance. It's just that there's a stronger signal. So in the obesity paper, what they talked about was the signal was likely related to hepatic ATP levels being decreased in the obese state due to the shunting of metabolic substrate. And so even if you have a lot of fat and the fat tissue is creating large amounts of leptin, if the liver is still signaling to the central nervous system that you have a decreased ATP level, then that can override the leptin signaling. So that was the theory within that paper. But here, what basically with a weight loss situation, as you decrease body fat, you're in an energetic restriction. Energetic restriction is more complete than just caloric restriction, although they're both closely related. You will lower your circulating leptin levels. Lowering the leptin levels will increase your appetite, and then it will also decrease your energy expenditure. So again, there's leptin and thyroid kind of on one side, it increase energy expenditure, and then leptin specifically signals satiety, whereas a decrease of active thyroid hormone T3 and a decrease in leptin basically signal that the lowering of thyroid will lower metabolic rate, lowering of leptin will decrease energy expenditure, and then lowering of leptin will increase appetite. So there's also a counter hormone to leptin, ghrelin, which they don't discuss here. The next hormone they talk about is insulin. They say insulin, which plays a crucial role in inhibiting muscle protein breakdown and regulating macronutrient metabolism, is considered another adiposity signal. Similar to leptin, high levels of insulin convey a message of energy availability and are associated with an anorexigenic effect. So anorexigenic effect meaning it signals to stop eating or decreasing appetite. So something that I think is misconstrued in a lot of these spheres is insulin being this negative hormone, just because you see these high levels of insulin in diabetes and other metabolic syndrome states, including to some, depending on the degree of obesity or the person's profile of obesity, and obesity as well. But insulin actually is an anabolic hormone. Insulin signals to the tissues, hey, we have carbohydrate on board, we can lower fat oxidation, we can drive glucose oxidation, and we can lower some of these catabolic hormones, glucagon, the catecholamines, glucocorticoids, etc. So it has like kind of an opposing effect to some of these catabolic hormones and some of these more catabolic processes, or the signaling of these processes, like excess fat oxidation and decreased carb oxidation. And insulin signals, or it can inhibit muscle protein breakdown, but it can also signal protein synthesis inside the cell and glycogen and fat synthesis inside the cell. So it has a general anabolic effect of signaling the cells to build and store. And then there's an idea that insulin is what's causing people to be fat. I don't think this is really the case. I think insulin is really just a signaling molecule of the current energy, the energy substrate and availability at the moment after a meal. So it's insulin I actually would view in a positive light. The issue, especially if we consider the previous paper I went over with obesity, is more of an inflammatory problem blocking carbohydrate oxidation at the mitochondrial level at aconitase specifically, and less likely a problem of just like there's just too much insulin. That's kind of a feature or a symptom of this more directed issue at energy metabolism related to inflammatory stimulus and signaling. So again, this paper here is going to talk about these different hormones, but it's important to put the hormonal perspective in a context of the energy metabolism overall, and then some of the inflammatory processes that could be happening in general. So this paper is talking about the negative effects overall here of heavy dieting, which is what's promoted to a lot of people who are overweight, but it doesn't. So it's from this perspective, it's good to know that there are negative effects and like what the effects are hormonally of this heavy dieting. So that's what we're covering. But as far as like fixing, like obesity or having a large amount of body fatness, that's more not necessarily a question of just targeting these different hormones. These are definitely a component of them. But if the underlying issue of the obesity situation is related to issues at energy metabolism at the mitochondria, then correcting that is probably paramount, and then perhaps incorporating some of these other strategies and manipulating these hormones would further optimize that process overall. So I'm using this paper to kind of add to the overall picture, not as a standalone, and also discuss some of the negative effects that can happen when you move into a heavy energetic deficit with increased activity, etc. Anyway, the next hormone they briefly touch on is ghrelin. So they say conversely, the orexigenic hormone ghrelin functions to stimulate appetite and food intake and has been shown to increase with fasting and decrease after feeding. So the kind of the opposite hormone of leptin, I guess that's a good heuristic to see it, but it's not 100% the reality, is ghrelin. And what ghrelin does is it stimulates appetite and food intake, and it elevates during fasting. So when you haven't been eating, and then after you eat, ghrelin will drop, and then leptin should technically increase. So they only briefly touch on ghrelin here. Next, and they starting to get into the more some of the more steroid hormones now. So they talk about here is testosterone. They say testosterone, known primarily for its role in increasing muscle protein synthesis and muscle mass, may also play a role in regulating adiposity. Changes in fat mass have been inversely correlated with testosterone levels, and it has been suggested that testosterone may repress adipogenesis. More research is needed to delineate the exact mechanisms by which testosterone affects adiposity. So you're kind of starting to see this breakdown, and an easy way to view this is you have thyroid, testosterone, perhaps leptin on one side, and an insulin. And on the other side, you have things like ghrelin. You have things like they're going to talk about here, glucocorticoids. You have the catecholamines, although the catecholamines kind of fall to both sides to some extent. We'll talk about that on the other side. So, and glucagon with the glucocorticoids. You have these catabolic hormones that have a suppressive effect on metabolic rate. And then on the other side, flip side, you have these more anabolic hormones that have a stimulatory effect on the metabolic rate. So as an example, insulin is signaling this adequacy of carbohydrate. It shuts down the catabolic processes. And then thyroid is increasing that metabolic rate altogether. When you have enough energy on board, you start to increase T3, active thyroid hormone T3. You increase conversion, particularly if you have adequate carbohydrate. And then you have the other hormones like the androgens, testosterone, DHT, DHEA, etc., that will push for an increase in tissue buildings, particularly lean mass. So when you have adequate energy on one side, you start to signal the stopping of catabolic processes, the increasing of energy expenditure, and then the increase in building of lean mass. And then on the flip side, with the more catabolic hormones, you have the signaling to start breaking down tissue, lowering the metabolic rate, and then increasing appetite. So they're kind of counter to each other. And they also, like in the research, they talk about different ratios, like insulin to glucagon ratio, or testosterone to cortisol ratio, or cortisol to DHEA ratio. And these are all functions because these hormones kind of offset each other to some extent. These are all, the ratios are basically describing indicative of the opposition of these different hormones to each other. So, and again, it's all centered around energy. It's all centered around energy availability and production in the body. So, and again, the important piece here to always keep in mind is that food intake, carbohydrate intake, etc., doesn't equal energy. Food intake, caloric intake, whatever it is, has to be converted to energy. And then once the energy is there, there's a switch in these different hormonal systems for a more anabolic energy expending system versus a more catabolic energetic reserving system. So again, if you have a blockage at that piece of conversion of food or substrate to actual energy, then can dysregulate all of these hormones. And I think that becomes really important here. Now here, what they're going to talk about in a bit after we get through some of these elements is the negative effects of trying to decrease caloric intake and increase energy expenditure and creating energetic deficits. You do upregulate these hormones. So the next hormone they talk about here is cortisol. They say cortisol, a glucocorticoid that influences macronutrient metabolism, has been shown to induce muscle protein breakdown and increase plasma cortisol within the physiologic range, has increased proteolysis in healthy subjects. Evidence also suggests that glucocorticoids may inhibit the action of leptin. So glucocorticoids, or elevations in glucocorticoids, and they say in specifically the physiologic range, can increase protein breakdown in healthy subjects. Why does it do that? Well, one of the mechanisms of the glucocorticoids is to take protein, amino acids, tissue, and convert that into glucose. This is gluconeogenesis. Now, you can have exogenous protein doing the same thing, so if you're eating large boluses of protein, but there's also an element of cortisol breaking down tissue, and then there's other negative effects of cortisol signaling on the system where it can start to slow down the metabolic rate, upregulate the conversion of androgens into estrogens by increasing aromatase expression, and then alter different hormones inside this, or different signaling pathways inside the cell. For example, upregulating acetyl-CoA carboxylase and signaling fat storage, and then also increasing the signaling effect of glucagon at the liver, so increasing gluconeogenesis through that mechanism, and then also increasing the breakdown or the release of fatty acids from fat tissues, increasing fatty acid oxidation. So it has a coordinated pathway of effects to basically slow down the system and then increase the catabolic processes and fatty acid oxidation, etc. So there's multiple negative effects of upregulating the glucocorticoids. This is known. Now, what they say next is they say, results from a number of studies indicate a general endocrine response to hypochloric diets that promotes increased hunger, reduces the metabolic rate, and threatens the maintenance of lean mass. Studies involving energy restriction or very low adiposity, so this is people very low adipose tissue, report decreases in leptin, insulin, testosterone, and thyroid hormones. Subsequently, increases in ghrelin and cortisol have been reported in energy restriction. Further, there's evidence to suggest that unfavorable changes in circulating hormone levels persist as subjects attempt to maintain a reduced body weight even after the cessation of active weight loss. So what they're showing is in hypocaloric diets, the metabolic rate reduces, you start to lose lean mass, or you can increase the rate of lean mass loss, and then hunger increases, rightfully so, right? You don't have enough energy on board, so your body's going to start to signal, hey, we need more food, because food is what's converted to energy, obviously. And then the metabolic rate also reduces. So, and this is extremely important. And this is what, when you talk about calories in and calories out type of situation, it's a moving target. And Jay and I have discussed this on our podcast before, but when you say you're 200 pounds and your daily metabolic rate with your activity, it calls for an estimation of 3,000 calories. Say you start to run a deficit. Say you only have 2,500 calories a day, and you start to lose body fat. you maybe losing lean muscle tissue depending on how you're doing this. Well, what winds up happening is now your body starts to drop your metabolic rate. So now your new target could be 2,200 calories because of the changes in these hormones from this processes that you've been running. Now, it's not perfect like that. It's just an example. I don't know how many calories it drops. But to continue to lose weight, then you have to then lower even more. And then you start to upregulate these hormones even further. And then you risk even more decreases in lean mass, increased hunger, and then the metabolic rate continues to drop. Now, as Jay and I have discussed before, there's issues with dropping the metabolic rate because many processes are dependent upon the metabolic rate. And a lot of these issues do stem around the hormones. So you start to see decreases in androgens. And this is known in bodybuilders. The bodybuilders stepping on stage who are natural, who aren't on any exogenous help, when they're shredded down to 5% body fat, they look great, super muscular, etc. I guess depending on what you think looks great or not, your subjective opinion there. But some of their testosterone levels have been tested to be like completely out of the reference range. And they also discuss feeling absolutely terrible. And that's through being in such a huge energetic deficit. So again, the loss of body fat or putting yourself in not necessarily the loss of body fat, but putting yourself in an energetic deficit. It's a moving target. The metabolic rate continually trends down as you increase your energy expenditure and decrease your energy intake. So the body starts to adaptively regulate. So it's hard to just say, oh, calories in, calories out, because you have this constant dial that's being adjusted based on all these external factors, particularly what you're putting in your mouth, how much food you're eating on a regular basis, what types of food you're eating, etc., and what's blocking perhaps that food conversion to energy. Other thing they discuss is when they talk about this hormonal perturbations that happen with low caloric eating, and you see decreases in leptin, insulin, testosterone, and thyroid hormones, and increases glucocorticoids and ghrelin. The other thing that's really important here that they discuss is that these negative hormonal effects persist when subjects try to maintain the reduced body weight even after we're actively losing the weight. So say you're 200 pounds, you want to get down to 180. The negative hormonal effects can still persist even when you're at the 180 pounds, even though you're not trying to decrease your weight even further. So and as they're going to get to in a bit, these effects can last for quite a while, which can increase the risk of actually putting on body fat overall because of the hormonal profile. So as they continue, they say, low energy intake and minimal body fat are perceived as indicators of energy unavailability, resulting in a homeostatic endocrine response aimed at conserving energy and promoting energy intake. From a survival standpoint, this makes sense, right? If the environment is signaling that there's not enough food available, then what winds up happening is the body is coordinating an endocrine response, a signaling response, saying, hey, we don't have enough energy on board. Let's down-regulate our metabolic processes. Let's not be wasteful with our energy expenditure. They continue to say, it should be noted that despite alterations in plasma levels of anabolic and catabolic hormones, losses of lean body mass often fail to reach statistical significance in studies on bodybuilding preparation. Although the lack of significance may relate to insufficient statistical power, these findings may indicate that unfavorable hormone-mediated changes in lean body mass can potentially be attenuated by sound training and nutritional practices. Previous research has indicated that structured resistance training and sufficient protein intake, both commonly employed in bodybuilding contest preparation, preserves lean body mass during energy restriction. I mean, basically what they're talking about is putting a stimulus on the muscle to say, hey, we need to maintain our muscle tissue, even though we're in an energetic deficit, and then also having adequate protein intake. So if the body is going to upregulate gluconeogenesis because of these catabolic hormones, the amino acids and proteins that it's going to use from your diet are more likely to source in your own tissues. These types of things can help to preserve lean body mass in these states, and this is known within the bodybuilding sphere. It's why bodybuilders try to or often incorporate ridiculous amounts of protein on a regular basis. Although the research, and this was pointed out through the work of Menno Henselman, has been validated by multiple researchers many times forward, is that the optimal intake seems to be about 0.6 to 0.8 grams per pound of body weight on a daily basis. and that's to preserve lean body mass, increase lean body mass. And I think this occurs even in situations where you're in deficits. So that seems to be around a good level of protein intake for people. And then also the training stimulus helps to decrease losses in lean mass during these energetic deficits that people would be running. And again, this is general bodybuilding information. This paper is written by people within the bodybuilding community. So they continue further. Maestu et al. Speculate that losses in lean body mass are dependent on the magnitude of weight loss and degree of adiposity, as the subjects who lost the greatest amount of weight and achieved the lowest final body fat percentage in the study saw the greatest losses of lean body mass. The hormonal environment created by low adiposity and energy restriction appears to promote weight regain and threaten lean mass retention, but more research is needed to determine the chronic impact of these observed alterations in circulating anabolic and catabolic hormones. Again, what they're just showing here is that with large amounts of body weight loss, there is a decent amount of body fat percentage loss, but also a large amount of lean body mass can be lost as well. And again, so the low adiposity and the energy restriction. So again, with the low adiposity piece, it's important to understand that there's an area with each individual where there's a healthy adiposity. Now, the cultural norm may not necessarily indicate the healthy adiposity for that individual. Some people are generally leaner than others, so they may function, their hormones may be adjusted to a different degree than at different adiposities. But I don't think that like obesity or extremely high body fat percentages would be considered the norm. I also don't think that the shredded bodybuilders at 6 to 8% body fat all year round is the norm either. I think it's more like there's a happy medium. I just don't know what the exact area would be or the averages for the healthy body fat percentages. There are some charts that look at this. I think for young men, it's somewhere between 10 to 20% body fat. Not young men, but men across the lifespan, somewhere between 10 to 20% body fat, where as you're younger, the lower body fat percentage seems to be more regular, and as you get older, it seems that a higher body fat percentage starts to become more a bit of the norm. And then for women, it's somewhere between 20 to 30% body fat seems to be healthy. And again, where you fall on this is dependent upon a host of factors, including your own predisposition. So seems to be healthy body fat levels, and then falling below those body fat levels signals to the body, hey, we have an energetic deficit, as well as being in an energetic deficit that causes these changes in the metabolic, in the hormonal profile that signals that specific energetic deficit. Hey, it's basically the body saying, hey, we don't have enough energy on board. Now we have to change all these processes in a coordinated fashion to preserve our energy and also maintain our body mass. Because again, if your body mass becomes too low, or you don't have enough energy on a regular basis, and you're still running at a high metabolic rate, you're at risk of causing almost severe metabolic aberrations, but also eventually death. So these are adaptive survival processes that we've developed. So it's important to keep in mind that it's not that these things are bad; they make sense in the different contexts. But if you understand these different contexts and how the body's responding, then perhaps you can co-opt, or you can work with the system to a large extent to get your body weight or your body fat to a healthy level without causing these hormonal aberrations and loss in lean body mass, etc. So again, that's a little bit tangential. We'll get to that in a bit. But what we're going to talk about now, they're going to break down different areas of the total daily expenditure, and there's basically the amount of energy that you're going to spend over the course of a day. There's different areas where that energy is spent, and they're going to break down the changes that occur in these different areas with dieting. So this is another piece in conjunction with the hormonal stuff. Again, this wasn't a super in-depth hormonal element, but it did give us a nice overview. So what they start here is they say an individual's total daily energy expenditure, the TDEE, is comprised of a number of distinct components. The largest component, resting energy expenditure, refers to the basal metabolic rate. So this is basically the energy expenditure that you have at rest doing absolutely nothing, and that's just for normal body processes to occur. The other component, known as non-resting energy expenditure, can be further divided into exercise activity thermogenesis. So the energy that's produced during exercise, or the energy that's needed or used during exercise. Non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So this is the other energy that's required for other activities during life that aren't specific to exercise. And then the last one is the thermic effect of food. So this is the amount of energy required in the digestion process of food. So as you see here, they give us this nice little graph. You have total daily energy expenditure is this whole bar. They have it as a percentage up to 100%. Then total daily energy expenditure is broken into resting energy expenditure and then non-resting energy expenditure. So this is your BMR, your basal metabolic rate. This is the amount of energy needed on a regular basis just to maintain your body processes. And then this is the energy that's needed outside of just general body processes overall. So you have non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This is fidgeting, moving around, doing all, whatever little housework you have to do, etc. Just like kind of the non-exercise related activity. And then over here, you have the thermic effect of food. So this is the amount of energy required to break down your food. A lot of people aren't aware, but digestion is an energy-intensive process. It requires a decent amount of energy to function appropriately. And then the last one is exercise activity thermogenesis. So this is the amount of energy that's generated when people exercise, whether that's bodybuilding or running on a treadmill, etc. Whatever your form, it may be sports. Now, this can possibly be increased depending on how much exercise you're doing, but generally it's not going to come close to comparing to your basal metabolic rate or just the general movements and whatnot you do throughout the day, or even digestion. This is usually the lowest unless you're seriously doing a ridiculous amount of exercise on a regular basis. And as Jay and I discussed in a previous podcast, this doesn't necessarily mean that if you increase your exercise activity thermogenesis, that it's just going to increase your energy expenditure even further. So just increase your metabolic rate, the amount of calories that you're going to burn, oxidize through on a regular basis. You can start to take away from these other processes. So you have to be careful. There's a limit to how much energy the body can produce on a regular basis. And if you start to surpass that with exercise, then there's a good chance that you can start to take away energy from other necessary processes, whether that's digestion, whether that's hormonal processes, whether that's neural processes, etc. Excuse me one sec. So as they continue here, they say metabolic rate is dynamic in nature, and previous literature has shown that energy restriction and weight loss affect numerous components of energy expenditure. So your metabolic rate, your total daily energy expenditure, is dynamic. This can adjust based on the different elements of your lifestyle, and restricting energy and moving into weight loss, as they're going to discuss here, can actually decrease your total daily energy expenditure, which will make it more likely that you put on weight or harder to lose weight. So what they say is in weight loss, total daily energy expenditure has consistently been shown to decrease. Weight loss results in a loss of metabolically active tissue and therefore decreases basal metabolic rate. So when you're losing weight, you are losing fat, but you are also most likely losing lean body mass. So there's the loss in tissue overall, the loss of health of this tissue in general is going to decrease the basal metabolic rate to some extent because that tissue does need energy to exist in general. They continue here. They say, interestingly, the decline in total daily energy expenditure often exceeds the magnitude predicted by the loss of body mass. Previous literature refers to this excessive drop in total daily energy expenditure as adaptive thermogenesis and suggests that it functions to promote the restoration of baseline body weight. Adaptive thermogenesis may help to partially explain the increased difficulty experienced when weight loss plateaus despite low caloric intake and the common propensity to regain weight after weight loss. So what they talk about here is that total daily energy expenditure actually decreases more than you would think would happen with this loss of body mass. So as an example to break this down, say I'm 200 pounds and I need 3,000 calories a day. If I go down to 180 pounds, say that loss of 20 pounds I would assume that now my metabolic rate would probably be more like 2,800 calories per day, because of that loss of 20 pounds of body weight that would have oxidized energy as well. What they're saying here is that with this weight loss process, and the metabolic rate doesn't go to 2,800, it actually goes to 2,500. So the body's metabolic rate gets down-regulated as a whole more than would be expected just from the loss in this body mass. And what they're saying is that this occurs, or the hypothesis is that this is occurring through a change in adaptive thermogenesis. So thermogenesis is the production of heat by the body overall. And so this adaptive thermogenesis is a down-regulation in the production of body heat in states where you're in an energetic deficit. And this could be part of the explanation for this increased or this highly increased loss in metabolic rate, more than what would be assumed for just the loss in that body mass. So there's basically the body is adaptively regulating metabolism so that you can essentially try to regain the weight that you lost by adjusting the metabolic rate overall. So there's an adaptive process to try to maintain this body weight at a certain state, or at least try to maintain this energetic state. So if it's not appropriate, the body will start to downregulate even more so than just what would be expected for this loss in body mass. They go on to further say exercise activity thermogenesis also drops in response to weight loss. In activity that involves locomotion, it is clear that reduced body mass will reduce the energy needed to complete a given activity or a given amount of activity. Interestingly, when external weight is added to match the subject's baseline weight, energy expenditure to complete a given workload remains below baseline. So if you were going to do exercise, any type of exercise, say you're going to go for a hike and you're 300 pounds, the person who's 300 pounds would expend more energy on the hike by the sheer fact that they have more tissue to move this certain amount of distance than somebody who's 200 pounds. Now, say that person who's 300 pounds loses 100 pounds. Now they're 200 pounds. Their metabolic rate is actually lower than what would be expected for their 200 pound body weight during this exercise overall. So that 100 pounds that they lost of body weight would have its own metabolic activity, and then the weight itself would increase the energy required to move at a given distance. What they're saying is, even with that, once that 100 pounds is lost, the amount of energy that's used is actually decreased in more than what would be expected. And then what they talk about here is if they add, so say they take that 300 pound person, they're 200 pounds now, and then they give them 100 pounds. They add another 100 pounds to them, and then they have them go to the hike. So this is not like they're putting on 100 pounds of body weight. They're just adding 100 pounds of weight. What they're saying is that the energy expenditure to complete that workload is still less than what they would have expected for somebody who had to move that 300 pounds. So, and this is indicative to some extent of this decreased metabolic rate overall for this individual. So again, as you start to lose that weight, the body adaptively down-regulates, or if you're in an energy deficiency, the body adaptively down-regulates energy expenditure to preserve the body mass, to preserve tissue, and to preserve the body's processes to some extent, or at least the essential processes. They say it has been speculated that this increase in skeletal muscle efficiency may be related to the persistent hypothyroidism and hypoleptinemia that accompany weight loss, resulting in a lower respiratory quotient and greater reliance on lipid metabolism. So what they're discussing here is they're saying that when you're in an energetic deficit, say you're just as a correlative, a caloric deficit, that's going to induce a hypothyroid, hypoleptinemia, or leptinemic state that goes with that weight loss, with that energetic deficiency. And then this leads to an upregulation in lipid metabolism and a change in the respiratory quotient. So, why is this happening? Well, the adaptive hormones are upregulating glucocorticoids, catecholamines, glucagon, etc., and are driving an increase in lipid metabolism, again, I've talked about this in the Randall cycle video, but when you're at a caloric deficit or you're at an energetic deficit, the body starts to kind of break down or cannibalize its own tissues, its fat stores, its muscle, its protein stores, turn that protein into carbohydrate so that it can send that to the tissues that really need it, like the central nervous system. And then the rest of the tissues start to oxidize fatty acids and become physiologically insulin resistant so that they can spare that glucose for the central nervous system. So that will change the overall respiratory quotient of the body. The respiratory quotient is an indicator of fat versus carbohydrate oxidation by looking at the ratio between CO2 and CO2 production and oxygen utilization. And the reason that's important, and as I talked about in the Randall cycle video, is that carbohydrate oxidation increases the amount of CO2 that's produced in ratio to the amount of oxygen that's consumed, whereas fatty acids actually decrease the amount of CO2 that's produced in ratio to oxygen that's consumed. So if you want to determine how much carb versus fat you're oxidizing, you can look at this respiratory quotient as a proxy measure. So again, this state of inadequate energy lowers thyroid hormone signaling, lowers leptin signaling, increases fatty acid oxidation, and increases these catabolic hormonal processes. And this is a bit tangential, but this is one of the reasons why heavily pushing fatty acid oxidation isn't ideal, because that is the default stress state, is running through this fatty acid oxidation. When you start to heavily upregulate fatty acid oxidation and downregulate glucose oxidation signaling, insulin, etc., you start to downregulate thyroid hormone signaling, you're creating a state that is signaling a stress to the body. You're upregulating these stress hormones. And again, the glucocorticoids and glucagon don't need to be out of the reference range for the processes to not be ideal. They can be elevated within the top of the reference range, indicating a problem. Or, as Jay and I discussed on our Rob Wolf podcast, the glucocorticoid signaling at the cell can be adjusted through the 11-beta HSD 1 and 2 enzymes and upregulate local glucocorticoid signaling in low-carb, high-fat diets, even if the glucocorticoid signaling isn't massively upregulated in the serum. So that's something that's interesting to keep in mind, as well as what's going on at the cell. So they continue here. They say the thermic effect of food encompasses the energy expended in the process of ingesting, absorbing, metabolizing, and storing nutrients from food. Roughly 10% of the total daily energy expenditure is attributed to the thermic effect of food, with values varying based on the macronutrient composition of the diet. So roughly 10% of total daily energy expenditure is attributed to the thermic effect of food, with values varying based on the macronutrient composition of the diet. While the relative magnitude of thermic effect of food does not appear to change with energy restriction, such dietary restriction involves the consumption of fewer total calories and therefore decreases the absolute magnitude of the thermic effect of food. So the thermic effect of food is still, even in a caloric deficit, would still take up about, what did they say here? 10% of the total daily energy expenditure. However, when you're in when you're in an energetic restriction, or you're basically in a caloric restriction, food restriction, since you're going to be processing less food overall, you're going to decrease the amount of energy needed on a regular basis to process that food. So in an absolute sense, so say you need 400 calories a day. It costs you 400 calories a day to process food or 500 calories a day to process food on a 1,000 calorie diet, right? And again, I'm just giving easy numbers. This isn't perfect. This is just an example. But if it takes 500 calories a day to process food on a 1,000 calorie diet, if your diet goes to 800 calories a day, now it's gonna be about 400 calories to process that food. Why? Because the total food amount that you're processing has dropped. So the percentage, you're still at, your thermic effect of food here would still be 50% of your energy expenditure, but the total amount of energy that it costs to process that food has decreased. Hopefully that's clear for everybody. Anyway, to continue, the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or energy expended during non-exercise movement, such as fidgeting or normal daily activities, also decreases with an energy deficit. there's evidence to suggest that spontaneous physical activity, a component of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, is decreased in energy-restricted subjects, and many remain suppressed for some time after subjects return to ad libitum feeding. Persistent suppression of non-exercise activity thermogenesis may contribute to weight regain in the post-diet period. So this is just your daily movement. This is just cooking, housework, chores, whatever you do at work, fidgeting if you're in a chair. Like, for example, for me, I fidget a lot. You can actually, if you ever ask Jay, like on our first podcast that we were doing together, I had a huge problem sitting still for long periods of time. I always was fidgeting. And even now, like, as I do these videos, sometimes I'll be like shaking my leg under the table, or you see like I keep moving my hand. But that fidgeting activity, when you're in caloric restriction or you're in an energetic deficit, will actually decrease. And so in the previous obesity paper that I was discussing, the authors were mentioning that obese people tend to have a decrease in their daily activity levels and persistent fatigue. And this could be related, again, because they have and this as well here is at the cellular level, you have an energetic deficit because you're not taking in enough substrate to convert to energy if you're going to be moving into these energy-restricted diets. And in the obesity situation, it's akin to this state because with the obese people, there's an energy deficit at the cell, even if there's a substrate excess, a substrate excess at the cell, and that's related to a blockage, again, at the conversion of that substrate to energy. The other thing that's really interesting here that they discuss is that the non-exercise activity thermogenesis is decreased in these subjects even when they return to ad libitum eating, at least for a period of time. So once you return to eating a normal amount of food and not restricting yourself, this activity is still decreased for a period of time. So there's a lingering effect, and this may actually increase your likelihood of putting on weight. So they continue to say, in order to manipulate an individual's body mass, energy intake must be adjusted based on the individual's energy expenditure. In the context of weight loss or maintaining a reduced body weight, this process is complicated by the dynamic nature of energy expenditure. In response to weight loss, reductions in total daily energy expenditure, basal metabolic rate, exercise activity thermogenesis, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and the thermic effect of food are observed. Due to adaptive thermogenesis, total daily energy expenditure is lower to extent that exceeds the magnitude predicted by losses in body mass. Furthermore, research indicates that adaptive thermogenesis and decreased energy expenditure persists after the active weight loss period, even in subjects who have maintained a reduced body weight for over a year. These changes serve to minimize the energy deficit, attenuate further loss of body mass, and promote weight regain in weight-reduced subjects. So essentially, when you embark on a weight loss process, you will lower all of these markers of energy expenditure in the day, and that they're going to be lowered, many of them, to an extent more than you would expect just by the loss in metabolically active body tissue. And then even if you maintain that weight loss for a year, there's still decreases in energy expenditure at that reduced body weight. So the metabolic rate still is lower to an extent more than you would expect, even after a year of maintaining that body weight. And then it basically is saying that the reason why, or the hypothesized reason why, is that the lowered metabolic rate is there to minimize any further energy deficit, stop any further loss of body mass, and then promote weight regain. So basically bring your body back up to that weight. I don't think, so this is again through like exercise and caloric restriction methods. I think that understanding these mechanisms, there is a way to induce weight loss without necessarily losing large amounts of lean body mass, and also without causing massive changes in like the hormones in a negative fashion. I think that there's definitely a safe way to do it, and it's like a kind of a balancing act. So you have to, again, if the weight gain, like for example in obesity or diabetes or other metabolic aberrations, that is a function of like inflammatory signaling and issues with conversion of substrate to energy, and less so of just like an overeating situation, or like an athlete who's 14% body fat but needs to get to 6% body fat for their bodybuilding show. And those situations, those are different. Those are very different from each other. I'm not interested in talking about how to get a bodybuilding athlete from 10% to 4% so they can step on stage. My perspective here, I'm more interested in discussing how do I take somebody who has metabolic aberrations, gained a large amount of body weight, and get them to lose that body weight without, or the excess body fats, but not body weight. I want people to lose body fat without causing massive hormonal disruption. And so I think part of that is understanding the issues from substrate conversion to energy, and then also understanding how to balance these issues with the with hormones in inducing an energetic deficit. So I think that there's multiple elements to kind of balance here. I'm not going to talk about all of those things here because I do want to get through the study, but this study helps to give us framework to discuss some of these mechanisms. Let's just see how much we have left here. Okay, so we just have this one more page after this one. Okay, so now they're talking about changes in the mitochondria. They're talking about uncoupling proteins like I mentioned before. And what they say here is protons may also leak across so I guess I'll read this here for you guys just to give you a context. A series of chemical reactions must take place to derive ATP from stored and ingested energy substrates. In aerobic metabolism, this process involves the movement of protons across the inner mitochondrial membrane. When the protons are transported by ATP synthase, ATP is produced. So they're just talking about Krebs cycle to electron transport chain. At the electron transport chain, the proteins move protons across the membrane, create a proton gradient. Those protons then move down through ATP synthase, and then they produce ATP. So now there's a situation here where they talk about uncoupling proteins, and these proteins, what they do is they take the protons and they allow them to leak across the mitochondrial membrane, and basically they leak across in the form of heat, and they don't produce ATP, and that's why it's called uncoupling, because you're uncoupling the Krebs cycle to production of ATP. But they say protons may also leak across the inner mitochondrial membrane by way of uncoupling proteins. In this uncoupled respiration, energy substrate oxidation and oxygen consumption occur, but the process does not yield ATP. Proton leak is a significant contributor to energy expenditure, accounting for roughly to 20 to 30% of BMR in rats. Now, something to keep in mind here is the uncoupling function in rats, specifically in brown adipose tissue, is a bit different than in humans. And they're still trying to elucidate just how much brown adipose tissue and uncoupling functions within energy expenditure in humans. So that's still an area that's being explored. So the energy expenditures may not really be as high as they discuss here in rats. So that's something to keep in mind. But essentially, this uncoupling process, which forms heat, it's triggered through thyroid hormones and catecholamines in humans and in rats. This process can be downregulated in states of energetic deficiency, and it increases mitochondrial efficiency because it increases the flow of it increases the production of ATP from the electron carriers NADH and FADH2 that are produced in the Krebs cycle, and minimizes the loss of this electron flow across the electron transport chain and subsequent production of protons. It minimizes their loss in the form of heat and increases their production of ATP, or energy specifically. So what they say, in the condition of caloric restriction, proton leak is reduced. Uncoupling protein 1 and uncoupling protein 3, the primary uncoupling proteins of brown adipose tissue and skeletal muscle, are of particular interest due to their potentially significant roles in energy expenditure and uncoupled thermogenesis. Skeletal muscle's large contribution to energy expenditure has directed attention towards literature reporting increases in uncoupling protein 3 expression in response to, or decreases in uncoupling protein 3 expression in response to energy restriction. So essentially, when your energy is restricted, the body's, particularly the skeletal muscle, which has a what they're discussing here, larger amount of the uncoupling proteins, uncoupling protein 3 specifically, but the brown adipose tissue has uncoupling protein 1 and uncoupling protein 3. What winds up happening is the body stops basically turning the substrate into heat and focuses it more on ATP, so the energy medium. And so this can decrease the overall metabolic rate. It creates a less wasteful metabolic rate overall. What they wind up saying is decreased uncoupling protein 3 expression could potentially play a role in decreasing energy expenditure, and uncoupling protein 3 expression has been negatively correlated with body mass index and positively correlated with metabolic rate during sleep. So upregulation in uncoupling protein 3 is basically, so with increased uncoupling protein 3 expression, there's an association with decreased body mass and increased metabolic rate during sleep. Again, the uncoupling protein is taking the energy produced in the Krebs cycle in the form of electron carriers, NADH and FADH2, or reduced electron carriers more specifically. They're reduced because the electrons are added to them. The electrons have a negative charge, so there's a reduction in charge, and then the protons are also added or move on as well. What winds up happening is those carriers, the electrons that they're moving through to create this proton gradient in the inner mitochondrial membrane, with uncoupling protein 3, it stops it downregulates uncoupling protein 3 expression and energy restriction, and then that winds up leading to a lack or a loss of the flow of protons through that uncoupling protein and leading to the formation of heat and focusing those protons to move down through ATPase and produce ATP. So you have a less wasteful metabolism overall, and that makes sense in this context, right? Because if you're at an energy deficit because you don't have enough substrate coming in, or you're increasing your activity level, you don't want to waste the precious energy that you have. So you don't waste it in the form of heat. You move it more towards the formation of ATP. They further say uncoupling protein 1 appears to play a pivotal role in uncoupled thermogenic activity of brown adipose tissue. Energy restriction has been shown to decrease brown adipose tissue activation and uncoupling protein 1 expression, indicating an increase in metabolic efficiency. Along with uncoupling protein 1 expression, thyroid hormone and leptin affect the magnitude of uncoupled respiration in brown adipose tissue. Thyroid hormone and leptin are associated with increased brown adipose tissue activation, whereas glucocorticoids oppose the brown adipose tissue activating function of leptin. Evidence indicates that thyroid hormone plays a prominent role in modulating the magnitude of proton leak, with low thyroid hormone levels associated with decreased proton leak. The endocrine response to energy restriction, including increased cortisol and decreased thyroid hormone and leptin, could potentially play a regulatory role in uncoupled respiration in brown adipose tissue. Okay, so what they're saying here is in energy restriction, glucocorticoids can be upregulated, and glucocorticoids have an opposing effect on the uncoupling protein expression at the brown adipose tissue. Whereas when you have adequate energy on board, thyroid hormone and leptin can upregulate, and then they increase the uncoupling protein expression. Now, why is this important? Because a lot of people ask, well, if I eat enough, if I have enough in my diet, how am I going to lose weight? Well, this could be a possible mechanism here that can help by upregulating thyroid hormone function. You're increasing the movement of substrate through the mitochondria, and not all of it gets moved to ATP. It can be moved through uncoupling to produce heat. So this is one of the mechanisms that gets down-regulated in energy restriction, but up-regulated when you have adequate energy on board. The body's like, okay, we have adequate energy, so we can turn some of this energy directly into heat, and then with adequate energy and carbohydrate on board, you will signal an increase in thyroid hormone as well as leptin. So just something interesting to keep in mind, whereas in the opposite, you upregulate glucocorticoids, which have, again, the opposing effect. When they're talking about here in that proton leak, the proton leak is specifically related to the uncoupling protein, as I discussed. They further say it is not clear if decreases in proton leak and uncoupling protein expression persist until weight reverts to baseline, but there's evidence to suggest a persistent adaptation, which mirrors the persistent downregulation of thyroid hormone and leptin. So when you lose significant amount of body fat by decreasing the energy on board, what winds up happening is you have a persistent adaptation of decreased uncoupling or decreased loss, I guess isn't the perfect word, of the proton gradient in the form of heat through the uncoupling protein. So again, these metabolic aberrations persist when you move into this heavy weight loss state. or which is essentially creating an energetic deficiency. So the body adaptively responds to this, and it does last longer than you would expect overall. It says changes observed in proton leak, uncoupling protein expression, and circulating hormones appear to influence metabolic efficiency and energy expenditure. In the context of energy restriction, the observed changes are likely to make weight loss increasingly challenging and promote weight regain. It has been reported that females have more brown adipose tissue than males, and that energy-restricted female rats see greater decreases in brown adipose tissue mass and uncoupling protein 1 than males, indicating a potential sex-related difference in uncoupled respiration during weight loss. So what they're saying here, first part, pretty simple. With decrease in uncoupling protein expression and a lack of proton leak, you have a decrease in the metabolic rate overall, which makes it more likely to promote weight gain, and you're less likely to lose weight. So again, that's that moving target in terms of calories in, calories out, and energy expenditure. And this is through the hormonal processes. The body is trying to make sure that it has adequate energy on board. So it's going to adjust these extraneous, or I guess extraneous isn't a perfect word, but extraneous processes. And then what they're showing here is that male or females, at least in rats, tend to have higher brown adipose tissue mass. And so they will have a larger drop in metabolic rate overall than the male rats will because of this downregulation in uncoupling protein. This is actually interesting because a lot of females, there's like a trope, or I guess a cliche, that it's easier for men to lose weight than women, and women will hold on to weight that they gain much more likely than men. And so this is showing it in rats, but what they're showing is that this downregulation in the metabolic rate and uncoupling in the brown adipose tissue from a decrease in uncoupling protein, perhaps this would hypothetically make it more likely for women, or for the female rats here at least, to gain weight than the male rats. Now, this kind of makes sense overall. The body fat, I think, is a bit more important in females due to the need for body fat for hormonal signaling for pregnancy and things along those lines. And females tend to have a much higher body fat percentage than men in general. So it would make more sense that the female system has some more in-depth regulatory systems and from a hormonal perspective around maintaining adequate body weight, especially in the context of pregnancy and whatnot. So just something to keep in mind. And now, in situations of menopause where a lot of women find that they increase weight, perhaps these mechanisms get dysregulated, and due to the increased likelihood that dysregulation of these mechanisms would lead to increased weight in menopause, when hormones in the different situations get very out of whack, especially in more modern societies because of numerous reasons. But in more modern societies, it leads to an increased likelihood of weight gain in women. So just something to keep in mind. This is me hypothesizing on it, but I'm not directly saying this in the study. Again, this was in rats, but just something interesting to think about. They continue here. They say, while future research may improve our understanding of the magnitude and relative importance of mitochondrial adaptations to energy restriction, current evidence suggests that increased mitochondrial efficiency and a decline in uncoupled respiration might serve to decrease the energy deficit in hypochloric conditions, making weight maintenance and further weight reduction more challenging. Again, this is what I was saying. It's that moving target. When the body senses an energy deficiency, it's going to downregulate metabolism to some extent so that you can maintain your lean body mass and you don't go into like a starvation or the extreme catabolic state. Again, this makes a lot of sense. It's important from a survival mechanism. What they continue here, they say, now they're going to talk about what this looks like in athletes, but this does have some relevance to normal people who aren't stepping on stage or performing in the Olympics as a gymnast or trying to cut weight to be in a wrestling class or anything like that. So they say hypochloric diets induce a number of adaptations that serve to prevent further weight loss and conserve energy. It's likely that the magnitude of these adaptations are proportional to the size of the energy deficit, so it is recommended to utilize the smallest possible deficit that yields appreciable weight loss. So a more slow and tapered weight loss process would be more helpful for the hormonal system overall, so that you don't strongly upregulate and signal these negative adaptations overall. Makes sense. They say this may decrease the rate of weight loss, but attenuate unfavorable adaptations that challenge successful reduction of fat mass. Weight reduction should be viewed as a stepwise process in this context. As weight loss begins to plateau, energy intake or expenditure should be adjusted to reopen the energy deficit. So they're talking about if you decrease your calories and then you lose the weight a little bit and then the body down regulates metabolism, then you go to that next step down in terms of decreasing your intake again below your metabolic rate. And so it's talking about continually stepping down. However, in this specific situation, I wonder if you decrease just a little bit and then you don't have this massive change in the hormonal profile, and then you induce a situation where you upregulate these beneficial anabolic hormones again. Maybe there's a mechanism where you can do that, where you can just keep a minor decreasing in caloric intake to some extent, upregulate these mechanisms again, and then you can still maintain that same thing without having to continually step down your caloric intake, because you are going to continually digging into the hole or walking yourself down into the hole metabolically as you do this. But I do agree that a lower deficit to some extent would make more sense than these massive, like super massive deficits causing serious issues. They continue, large caloric deficits are also likely to induce greater losses of lean body mass and compromise athletic performance and recovery, which are of critical importance to athletes. Again, having massive deficits, caloric deficits or energetic deficits, will increase lean body mass loss. So again, the goal in losing weight is not to lose lean body mass. Losing weight is probably a term that should be thrown out. You want to decrease body fat mass, and you want to maintain, if not build, lean body mass. That is the ultimate goal. The second portion may not be possible without exogenous help in terms of building while in a deficit. And it also depends on the deficit. But the maintenance of lean body mass is also an extreme priority when trying to lose body fat mass. Again, the lean body mass is protective for multiple different situations. Going in massive caloric deficits will cause a larger amount of loss of lean body mass, which isn't good. They continue to say participation in structured resistance training programs and sufficient protein intake are also likely to attenuate losses in lean body mass. Additionally, high protein diets are associated with increased satiety and thermogenesis, making them a better option for the calorie restricted athlete. Makes sense. So, resistance training and stimulus on the muscles, or creating an anabolic stimulus on the muscles while having adequate protein, can spare that muscle tissue and maintain lean body mass in the face of deficits. General bodybuilding strategy makes sense. They continue here. They say, while studies have utilized refeeding protocols that last 3 days, physique athletes such as bodybuilders and figure competitors often can incorporate 24-hour refeeds once or twice per week. The proposed goal of periodic refeeding is to temporarily increase circulating leptin and stimulate the metabolic rate. This is what I was talking about of increasing the metabolic rate without having to constantly step down as the metabolic rate adaptively downregulates. So if you can have a deficit and then increase the metabolic rate again, and then maintain that deficit and increase it again, you may be able to lose the weight without causing all this massive negative hormonal effects. So this is one method where you essentially have a refeed. So you're in a deficit, say Monday through Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday you have a refeed. So you increase your caloric intake again so that you can signal thyroid hormone and leptin, upregulate the metabolism, and then go back into a slight deficit. Again, smaller deficits would be more favorable from a hormonal perspective, even if they decreased your overall production or decrease your overall weight loss. Because again, it's not just weight loss, you want fat mass loss. So if you're having a large amount of weight loss and it's coming in the form of lean body mass with fat mass, that's not ideal. Even if the scale is going down, who cares? It doesn't matter. What's more important is that the fat mass is being lost while the lean body mass is being maintained and the hormonal profile is being maintained and not crapped on. Because when you come out the back end, if you induce a massive deficit, you lose a bunch of lean body mass, you're going to be worse off metabolically, or possibly worse off metabolically than when you had an excess of body fat mass. So they talk about here, there's not too many studies on it, but there are some. They say there's evidence indicating that leptin is acutely responsive to short-term overfeeding, is highly correlated with carbohydrate intake, and that pharmacologic administration of leptin reverses many unfavorable adaptations to energy restriction. While interventions have shown acute increases in leptin from short-term carbohydrate overfeeding, the reported effect on metabolic rate has been modest. Durrell Wanger et al. Reported a 7% increase in total daily energy expenditure. This increase amounts to approximately 138 kilocalories of additional energy expenditure, of which 36 kilocalories can be attributed to the thermic effect of carbohydrate intake itself. So on these refeeds, having larger amount of carbohydrates can help to increase leptin and most likely thyroid signaling as well. And then that can increase the metabolic rate again and minimize any massive decreases. There's probably other strategies that you can employ here, and this is what you see with bodybuilders using exogenous drugs, right? You take anabolic androgenic steroids that have an androgen signaling effect, which has somewhat of a counteractive effect on glucocorticoids. You would use thyroid hormone. You have an adequate protein diet. You lower your fat intake, but keep a decent amount of carbohydrate intake, so you can keep these hormones signaling. And then you also, some bodybuilders are using things like insulin and whatnot. And then you have the training effect as well. So if you combine those methods, you're basically optimizing these beneficial hormones and trying to minimize these negative hormones, creating a deficit and creating an anabolic stimulus on the muscle. If you take in consideration the obesity situation that I talked about in the previous study, where you have the blockage of substrate conversion to energy, if you can correct that, in that study they talked about lowering inflammation with aspirin and possibly using thyroid hormone, or I think they were talking about ephedrine there, but you could probably use thyroid hormone instead. That would be my guess. Again, that's my hypothesis. If you use that aspirin, thyroid hormone, maybe androgens, if you're in a very overweight state, you adjust your diet to minimize inflammatory signaling and gut issues that would upregulate cytokines that would block the blockage of substrate conversion to energy, and then possibly run androgens and things like that. You can maintain lean, on top of perhaps like a resistance training, you can maintain lean body mass, decrease fat mass, and avoid some of these negative metabolic effects overall. Now, again, the process, you would probably want to run this, you would want to avoid doing things that would massively destroy your hormonal system. So running like 300 milligrams of test a week or something. Again, I'm not telling people to take these exogenous drugs. I'm just hypothesizing based on these mechanisms. But taking like massive doses of these things probably wouldn't be ideal, especially considering if like the normal amount of androgens produced by a young male is like, I think on average 6 to 7 milligrams per day, maybe up to 10 in like genetically, or I don't know, whatever. There's some people who have a higher amount. Maybe it's genetics, maybe it's some of their lifestyle factors, whatever it is. So having it, like keeping things within a normal level there, and then minimizing other things on the other supplement side, and then optimizing training and whatnot, and then having refeeds and things like that would be a better overall strategy that would minimize these massive hormonal aberrations, because you don't want to just run super high doses of tests and then have to crash your entire hypothalamic pituitary testicular axis on the back end just to lose weight. So I think that there's a way to do this. Again, this is just hypothetical thinking about these things, but you knowing the effects of the hormones, and then also understanding what's going on in the obesity state and whatnot, you could probably go in and address all of these different issues to create a weight loss situation that doesn't metabolically cripple a person while allowing them to maintain lean body mass and then minimize the excess fat mass, and also fix all the other cardiometabolic factors as well. Okay, that's enough there. My computer's almost dead here, so I'm going to continue and finish out this study for you guys. They say, in the period shortly after cessation of a restrictive diet, body mass often reverts towards pre-diet values. This body mass is preferentially gained as fat mass in a phenomenon known as post-starvation obesity. So following weight loss or body mass loss, because of these metabolic adaptations, you're more likely to put on body fat on the back end, and they call this post-starvation obesity. While many of the metabolic adaptations to weight loss persist, a dramatic increase in energy intake results in rapid accumulation of fat mass. It is common for individuals to overshoot their baseline level of body fat, and leaner individuals, including many athletes, may be more susceptible to overshooting than obese individuals. Now, this is something that I've seen in the bioenergetic sphere. People come from these super restrictive diets of intermittent fasting with low carbohydrate intake, etc., and their caloric intakes are very low. They hop on bioenergetic, boom, 20, 30 pounds of weight gain, and a lot of in the form to some extent of body fat. I think the solution to this is introducing the foods in a stepwise fashion, and reverse dieting. They talk about it down low, but reverse dieting people out of the hole. Because when you're in that metabolic profile of decreased thyroid, decreased leptin, decreased androgens, increased glucocorticoids, increased glucagon, increased catecholamines, etc., all these different hormones, you're in a state that's primed towards body fat gain overall. And this is because of the metabolic, you have a downregulated metabolism to some extent. You're functioning more heavily on fat oxidation. And then you have these multiple different effects of these different hormones leading to this increased likelihood of this body fat gain overall. So you have to slowly dig yourself and step yourself back out of the hole instead of just jumping out of the hole. You can't just jump out of the hole. That's where you see people put on the body fat. So I think that there's ways to adjust this appropriately. It involves diet, it involves exercise, it involves possible different help with different supplementation and whatnot. So there's multiple things that I think can be done there to avoid the weight gain while also fixing the metabolic profile in a stepwise fashion. I guess slow and steady wins the race here. Now, what they continue to say, in such a situation, the individual may increase body fat beyond baseline levels, yet retain a metabolic rate that has yet to fully recover. There's evidence to suggest that adipocyte hyperplasia may occur early in the weight regain process, and that repeated cycles of weight loss and weight regain by athletes in sports with weight classes are associated with long-term weight gain. Therefore, athletes who aggressively diet for a competitive season rapidly regain weight may find it more challenging to achieve optimal body composition in subsequent seasons. This explains some of the yo-yo phenomenon we see in current modern culture, where you go on this diet for the wedding or for the summer or for whatever it is, and then you come back and then every subsequent time you gain weight, and then it's harder to lose. And that's because, again, of these negative effects on the hormonal profile and then not fully recovering them. And then they're saying here, even if they increase body fat levels beyond baseline levels after being in a caloric deficit, there's a chance that your metabolic rate hasn't recovered appropriately. So again, I think it's a delicate situation that has to be approached in a stepwise fashion. Last quote here, they say, to avoid rapid fat gain following the cessation of a diet, reverse dieting has also become popular among physique athletes. Such a process involves slowly increasing caloric intake in a stepwise fashion. In theory, providing a small caloric surplus may help to restore circulating hormone levels and energy expenditure toward pre-diet values while closely matching energy intake to the recovering metabolic rate in an effort to reduce fat accretion. Ideally, such a process would eventually restore circulating hormones and metabolic rate to baseline levels while avoiding rapid fat gain. While anecdotal reports of successful reverse dieting have led to an increase in its popularity, research is needed to evaluate its efficacy. Yeah, so this is essentially what I was saying. Stepwise increase calories. So you're not, and again, it's also food choice, food type. Supplementation can be used on board as well. Training can also be helpful. Adjusting volumes to your level of stress and how much energy you have on board as well can be important. And then basically this would allow the recovery of a metabolic rate without necessarily inducing large amounts of fat gain, because you're matching where you're at metabolically, slowly stepwise increasing up, and just gradually digging yourself out of the hole and allowing the hormones to adjust appropriately. So that would be those are just some mechanisms. Again, I glanced over them because there's more. It's quite in depth, and there's a whole process involved to fix this. But it's an interesting paper altogether discussing these mechanisms. I just want to show you guys this graph. I have 2%. Let's see. So if you decrease your energy intake, you increase your energy deficit, you decrease body mass. The decreased body mass and increased energy deficit causes a decrease in uncoupled respiration. It causes a decrease in anabolic, anorexigenic, and thermogenic hormones, and it increases orexigenic and catabolic hormones. This decreases energy expenditure and increases hunger. Orexigenic just involves hunger. So orexigenic hormones increase hunger and anorexigenic hormones decrease hunger. So this graphic here is just a basic description of what they're discussing. And then what they're saying is small incremental dietary adjustments can minimize these metabolic adaptations, and then periodic refeeding can help to minimize these metabolic adaptations. Also, there's training as well would be another thing to some extent to create a stimulus on the muscles and avoid some of the catabolic effects, but it doesn't affect all these other hormones overall. So this is just a nice overview. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this paper today. If you have any questions about this, or you have any comments, go ahead, leave a comment below the video. If you like the video, please give it a like, and I'll hope to catch you guys in the next one. I think I'm going to do a Randall cycle part 2 covering the carb oxidation, blocking fat oxidation. So look forward to seeing you guys in the next one. Take it easy.